I am Adam Weil, partner at White Rabbit Group. Welcome to the Pixel Perfect podcast, where we share knowledge, experiences, and motivations from creatives and entrepreneurs. All right, in this episode, I'm joined by Salwa Whiting, creative director at Stingray and founder of S2 Brand Solutions. She spent more than 15 years working alongside brand strategy, identity systems, and UX design, building a career really at the intersection of the creative side of things as well as team leadership. She's worked both in-house and as an independent advisor, which I think gives her a really interesting perspective on how modern creative teams like actually operate. And at Stingray and through S2, she really focuses on building strong creative teams, connecting brand strategy to execution, and developing design systems that hold up across every touch point. So we're going to talk about all those touch points. I'm really excited for this conversation. We're going to dive into how high performing creative teams are structured, how creative operations can protect quality and margins, and what it really takes to scale brand without kind of watering it down. So if you run an agency or you're leading a creative team, there's going to be a lot here about turning your creative function into a real growth driver instead of just a production department. So, Salwa, very excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me on, Adam. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. So let's just kind of start real fast about your career evolution. You began in kind of the art direction world and then later moved into in-house creative leadership roles. How has that path shaped how you approach design and brand today?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I started off my career in the art direction world. I was primarily working in agencies. I moved in house. But during my time period working at agencies, I really learned how to build big ideas, thinking kind of outside the box, really like get that campaign thinking.
Hmm.
And various agencies specialize in different fields, but for me, it was very much around campaigns. And so, really, what I learned on the agency side was building stories. And really, how do you tell a story about a brand, a product? But it was very much around we do a project, it would be completed, we'd move on to another brand. So
Hmm.
we were working with several brands, several types of products. Every project was different,
Mm.
and that was really exciting. And then when I moved in house, how that was different was you really deep dived into a specific brand.
Mm.
And so you really kind of like everybody knew the Pantone colors and all of the details of the brand by heart. You
Mm.
really learn how to build a system, and you understand how decisions um, design decisions can impact so many things across the organization, from like a call center, which you would never,
Mm.
I would never at sitting on the agency side, never even picture that. Legal and compliance, product design, like a
Mm.
bunch of different departments. So that was really interesting. I really on the in-house side focused on understanding how to build systems, how the brand scales, how important consistency is.
Mm.
Um, so from the agency side, I really learned how to sort of start to craft ideas, and then from the in-house side, how do you take those ideas and scale them and make them huge across the
Mm.
organization? How those designs then start to tie back to ROI.
Mm. I imagine that's not easy to do, and
Nope.
especially working within the financial services industry. That kind of introduces some unique constraints and like responsibilities there. So,
Yeah.
what's your perspective on how those constraints can maybe even like elevate the creative and UX standards rather than limit them? Is that even possible? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think yes, financial services is a very highly regulated industry, as several industries, and yes, the constraints are never not usually a bad thing. You kind of learn to work around those constraints. Sometimes that regulation also brings clarity. It brings more transparency. I mean, there is really with regulation in financial services, transparency is critical.
Mm.
People are handing you their money, their life savings, and you need to be clear. So as much as you want to focus on flashy designs and you can, but it has to be balanced with clarity.
Mm,
You have to simplify complexity, and financial services can be a very complex thing for people to understand. So
mm,
sometimes that means like you have tons and tons of disclaimers, or you can't use headlines or taglines that are vague. It has
mm,
to be really clear, direct. I do believe that leads to good design because ultimately it does build trust when you don't have things that, leave things for people to understand or to speculate on. It is clear.
mm,
Every design goes through several rounds of revisions. Several departments have their eye and their say in before it even gets to the customer. So I do think that it does bring clarity. It simplifies things. Also, when I was at Manulife, which is a financial organization here in Canada, it's John Hancock in the U.S.
mm,
Um, they were one of the first, in general, the financial industry was one of the first people that started talking about accessibility in design.
mm,
And accessibility is huge, especially in UX and UI design.
mhm.
And so that, things like contrast and details, all of that ended up tying back to really clean, crisp, clear UX, UI, and ultimately building the customer's trust.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, accessibility is so important now, and I think most people that don't have, um, or that have, very limited disabilities don't really understand the full spectrum of what the kind of disabilities there are out there. I think it's just very
Right.
easy to just think the world through your own lens instead of others, and, yeah, I'm very happy to see a lot of the accessible, design trends, I think, getting more, momentum today.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is nice to see that, and I do think that that paired us into a brand where at Manulife, I think we went with like from 12 or 15 color palette of like a giant color palette to like maybe three colors that were accessible, but that built a stronger brand presence for Manulife. But also, I think the the design, the easier it is to use for everybody. So
Mhm.
um, certainly those constraints helped us overall in the picture of design.
Right, right. On the other end of the spectrum, or at least I don't know, I think about them as a spectrum almost, with art direction being free range, free expression. How has your background there kind of influenced the way you do think about, broader UX and UI strategy?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I come from art direction, then I moved into UX, UI. I know a lot of designers have done that. Graphic designers have moved their careers. I also know many, there's a lot of overlap in psychology or even research,
Mm,
folks moving into UX and UI.
mm,
And it's always nice to see those transferable skills. With our direction, I've always had the philosophy of it's not just about making things look pretty. And it's, it is in the aesthetics is important, and we need to make sure that everything that we design looks aesthetically strong.
mm,
But an aesthetically strong designer, a good art director, is always keeping in mind like things like visual hierarchy or white space or tension between design elements. How do you direct the eye to specific elements?
mm,
So I feel that a lot of those learnings in our direction, like even just narrative thinking, all of those helped me in moving into the UX and UI field. Even just building visual systems, because I was building brand identities, and then you transfer that into UI systems and design systems. I think that those were all fairly transferable skills. And also, our direction does often tie into storytelling. And I
mm,
think with UX specifically, you are telling a story from a lens of a customer. You're guiding somebody through a journey.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of transferable skills with art direction going into UX and UI. Similarly, as I mentioned, there's so many other industries where people have moved from their industry into UX and UI and applied those skills, and it's great to see that.
Yeah, yeah. How do you when you're building kind of a brand system, like how do you ensure the UX and the UI decisions reinforce that brand strategy, rather than kind of work in isolation?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I think that oftentimes people think brand is a logo or or colors, and it is so much beyond that. I think that when you're building a brand, you need to understand what your brand DNA is. What does your brand stand for? And then not just UX and UI, but every team has to tie back to what that brand is. That means your tone of voice. That means how your call center answers their phone calls. That means maybe if you have a chat bot, the tone of voice has to be tied to the brand, and it applies to UX and UI as well. So it's really how the whole system behaves together. Um, if your brand with a lot of financial services, it's about clarity, as we talked about earlier, and a sense of like building stability and a strong presence. So the UX and UI decisions that are made are really all about building calm and intuitive design. If you have a brand that um, is innovative and out of the box, then you may make design decisions that are more clean, modern. Maybe they feel progressive. But never confusing in all cases. But really, ultimately, the UX and UI ties into the brand, and that could even mean as something as simple as like how your micro interactions on your websites come across. They all of those little details ultimately tie back to what your brand DNA is, what your brand purpose is, what your brand's tone of voice is. That includes art direction, but also, of course, UX and UI are expressions of the values of the brand.
You mentioned call centers a couple times. Tell me how that translates over, and what is the role there, and how does a designer even get involved in that conversation? Does one sort of make a suggestion that, hey, we should be involved in these sort of things, or is that a leadership decision further up that it says, hey, we need to have design oversee all of this? I'd love to understand more about that.
Yeah, I think sometimes design can for example, when I was at Home Trust, we built a digital banking app. And that would impact the call center, no question, because people would call to ask questions about if there's something not working on their app or they needed guidance. Um, and it really just comes down to we started to include them in our conversations as we were building the application
Mm,
because they bring their front line. They're dealing
mm,
directly with the customers. They understand the pain points. They understand where things are going well, where customers could be confused, how they typically tend to navigate systems. Because if you're designing things in a silo, you may be looking at, let's say, in this case, other financial institutions and seeing, oh, this other bank does it this way, so we should do the same thing. Or, um, maybe just through your past experience, but and even data is important, but you kind of need to balance it. I feel with something like the front line, where they're dealing directly with the customers, they can bring a lot of influence into the design, and vice versa. I think as a brand team, we can help them understand design how we've made certain decisions, what they mean, why we've made them, so that they apply that tone of voice when they
mm,
speak to the customer as well. So
mm,
kind of works both ways, but in my experience, I think it's
mm.
been invaluable to get insight from call centers, from any frontline staff, even if you have a retail store. Talk to them, understand how what their challenges are, what customers are interested in, and
Mhm.
I find that you always get a unique and interesting perspective.
Mm. Yeah. I love that, especially for, sometimes designers, I think, kind of pigeonhole themselves into a specific bucket of responsibility. And I think zooming out from that gives them a lot more power. And in a lot of ways, they are capable of making, the right decisions in those kind of situations, at least influencing it and aligning it back so that it's all
Yeah.
cohesive.
100%. Yeah, it goes into kind of more design strategy. So when you're talking about your design, even when you're sharing it with stakeholders, you can bring such a unique perspective that really allows it makes it easier for buy-in as well.
Mm,
When you can show that you've done the work of really understanding the organization, including the front line.
right, right. You mentioned that eliminating confusion in pretty much all cases is a good thing. I do wonder about financial services, and I feel like trust is one of those things that's probably a pillar you got to have. So, yeah, in industries like financial services where trust is critical, how does user experience design contribute directly to that credibility and the clarity and the user experience?
Yeah, in financial services, as you said, trust is everything. If you don't have trust, you don't have a business, pretty much.
Right.
It is built through, as I mentioned earlier, consistency is one of the biggest things.
Mm,
So consistency in the design, transparency in how we communicate, so clear language, no vague terms. Um, Creating some visible safeguards. I even find that sometimes it's okay to have a little friction, like oftentimes with design, we with UX and UI design, we want to create as seamless of a solution as possible with minimum friction. But in financial services, I find that it's okay to have friction. Let's say if you have an app where you're transferring money, it will often ask you like multiple times to confirm, are you
mm,
sure?
right.
And all of those things maybe
Mm,
are a little bit of an added friction. You have to go through the terms and agreements. Sometimes it gets you to scroll all the way to the bottom. So those are friction points technically from a standpoint of a user,
mm,
but they're confirmation steps. They do add a sense of confidence for the
mm,
user, even though they are friction points. So
mm,
with financial services, as you mentioned, trust is important, and it's all about clarity and
mm,
confirmation, and credibility comes from just making sure. Just double checking if that one last time to make sure that the
mhm,
customer really understands the impact of their decision.
mm. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, right? How creating friction can actually build trust.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never thought about it like that, but you're right, I guess, and I've had that thought, I think myself, even going through Zelle, I send money through Zelle sometimes, and sometimes it's so annoying, but I think afterwards, I guess it's probably for the best?
It is. There's a lot of industries, even healthcare operates in the same way where maybe there is, and there's a lot to be said in about healthcare systems, but sometimes there is additional friction for that reason. It's just to make sure, just to get that clarity, just to get that final confirmation. If there's, especially in health tech, I think those apps are
Mm,
designed really well.
mhm,
They do have those few added steps just to ensure that you understand, and also for their own protection, because ultimately they also need to make sure that they don't everything is fully transparent,
right,
um, both ways. So yeah, it's kind
mm,
of interesting to add a little bit of friction, but
mhm.
ultimately it does build confidence for the user.
Right. Yeah, I think Apple is also another organization that's done a really good job. They're always asking you permission, and
Yeah.
I would assume that people trust Apple a bit more than some of the other tech giants, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, and also they use super clear language that, and everybody can understand.
Right,
You don't need to be like super tech savvy
right,
to understand. Just like you don't need to be super financial savvy to be able to, in a good financial company that has given a lot of value to UX, open an account and do your basic stuff that you need, transferring money, and so on.
Right, right. I want to talk about, how UX translates to the physical world. You've worked across digital and physical environments. So how does UX thinking translate into kind of the experiential marketing side of things, and like the physical financial services spaces?
Yeah, I love this question. I feel that the physical spaces don't get as much as UX support as they need. But currently, I work at a company called Stingray, and it's a music company, and they have a whole music side of the business where they own several apps and so on and so forth. But I work on the B2B side, which is digital signage and music, and so. With digital signage, they typically work with several banks, retailers and so on in designing the space. So that's kind of where I come in as well. Designing the space, the digital signage, where it ends up, and also what the content is that goes on those signs. So a lot of this type of thinking around the UX comes into play when we're designing those spaces. So if you think about like user journeys, right? Like whether it's a journey through um, um, a digital interface or if it's a physical space. With a physical space, like let's say we're designing a retail store, let's say a clothing store, it would be very much the same. Like you put yourself in the customer's shoes, how they navigate through a store. Like they may first look outside the store, and usually there's digital signage that shows outside the store to draw you in, whether that's like a sale or promotion. And
Hmm.
then you come into the store. Maybe you find something that you'd like to wear. You take that to the fitting room, and there's an opportunity there to have signage as well. So we typically, could be like interactive signage where you can scan it and see what it pairs well with. So you add a little bit of that kind of interactivity there,
Mm,
and then when you're looking to check out, that's a whole other part of the journey where oftentimes people walk through those aisles where there's like socks and accessories and perfumes where
mm,
they want you to pick something up quick on the way. So obviously that's intentionally there, but
mhm,
also sometimes behind the cashier, like the cash register, there's signage as well.
mm,
So
mm,
that signage could be like buy one get one free, or just something to remind you, um, whatever that, if there's a promotion or anything,
mm,
to before you leave their store, before you make that purchase, that last little push.
mm,
So that essentially, but also how we choose lighting, is important. How the entire space is designed. If there is a user component, and typically you would, similarly to designing a digital interface, you would work with business teams and product teams and brand team and design, marketing and all of that.
mhm,
Designing a physical space, you also work with different teams. You work with real estate, you work with marketing, as so several other teams, but
mm,
it's the same thing. You're collaborating in a different way, and you're also putting yourself in the customer's shoes of how they would navigate it,
mm,
and ultimately, what action they're going to take in the store, whether they're browsing or whether they're looking to make a purchase. All of those are designed to ultimately help the person move through the space and reduce any friction
mm.
along the way.
Yeah, yeah, it's cool to hear that. I haven't worked a lot in the physical spaces world, but I imagine there's so much intentionality there. People don't even realize it.
Yeah, even the music,
Mm,
even the music is selected based on what the store needs. Like you
mm,
may not, if you go to a maternity store, you won't hear breakup music,
mhm, mhm,
or like there's all of these things. Grocery stores usually play really happy and positive music, right? So
mhm,
it's all designed to keep the customer calm,
mm,
and enjoy the process of shopping for whatever they're
mm.
looking for.
Yeah, now that I think about it, it's like you almost wanna consider all the different, um what senses, right?
Census, yeah,
Smell, right? Like touch, like everything is really
absolutely,
influencing how you're feeling and then associating that feeling with that brand or that store.
100%.
Yeah, yeah, it's really fun. I remember talking to someone a long time ago. He was a leader at Zumiez, the clothing store. I don't know if you heard of
Yeah,
Zumiez. It's like kind of a
yeah,
skateboarding
yeah,
type
yeah,
clothing
yeah,
store. Very popular, very big, and they would purposely leave the clothes messy on the racks. They would purposely kind of mess things up so it wasn't all orderly. And for them, that was they were looking for that type of disorderly, a little bit crazy kind of
yeah.
individual as a buyer,
That was their brand expression. Yeah.
and that was their brand expression. So it's just interesting how companies will approach it in different ways.
Yeah, it's pretty cool actually once you start to understand. And on the design side of things, it's a lot of fun because
Mm.
you really realize that not everything is cookie cutter.
Mhm.
To the customer, they may not even realize, but it is, as to your point, it is engaging the senses because the physical space is so much more immersive.
Mm.
And so there's a lot to consider
Mm.
when you're designing those spaces.
Yeah. How do you think about like what leadership practices help kind of ensure alignment without kind of slowing down the execution on that side of things?
Yeah. So oftentimes when you're building something big like a digital interface or designing a physical space, there are a lot of different teams and departments that intersect as you're doing that. So as a leader, it's really important to set goals right at the beginning
Mm.
and understand what are the shared principles within those teams. How do you ensure you're getting the stakeholders' input early enough? Um, and also, this is one thing that I feel close to, and I feel is really important, is really understanding what are some of the shared definitions of things. So,
Mm.
when we use language like, we want this to be super innovative. What does that mean? What does clarity mean?
Mm.
So really, really identifying and defining that together is
Mm.
critical, and the leader can help do that
Mm.
for the team. Sometimes, there's times where I've come across somebody thinks something is innovative and the other person feels it's dated, or somebody thinks something is really cool and swanky and other person thinks it's cheesy. So
Mm.
you really need to get the biases out and really get clear on how do you translate and the leader's job is ultimately comes to translation. How do you clearly identify what those words are
Mm.
and what they mean from a UX standpoint, and how does that become practical for the team, and what are the guardrails for the design principles that we're setting together? What are maybe some of the clear decision frameworks? I think those are some of the areas where leadership can add alignment across
Mm.
several functions,
Mhm.
um, and sort of bring them together, and so that everybody understands their role in the mix, and also the shared purpose for everyone.
Mm. Yeah, I love that idea on translating, like, even just defining, like, a word like clarity, like, you would think that that would be very obvious to people and
Yeah.
intuitive, but taking the time to really make sure everyone has the same definitions is such a
Yeah.
fundamental first step.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of the biggest areas I've seen pain points happen.
Mm.
Um and that's not just in when designing, like in every design, even before when I was an art director. I mean, there's design, and especially visual design, there's so much bias, there's so many opinions. Everybody's super passionate about what we're building, and that is amazing. But we need to really get clear on how we describe what we're building, and
Mm.
what are the shared definitions. Absolutely.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, especially too when there's, like, trendy words that come about, I think that
Yeah.
that's where people get picked up too.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank
absolutely.
oh, it's so clean. I feel like a one that's really
Yeah,
picked up in the recent years.
yeah. Everybody wants clean, but they don't know what it is. What does
Yeah.
clean mean? Even like something like white space. People are like, "Oh, we need white space," but a lot of people, I've realized that they think white space is like white, and it doesn't like if you change it to another color, it's no longer white space.
Right.
So yeah, it's like all of those like little things, because you're not dealing with people that really are fully fully understand design, but everybody is passionate about design, and they do have their own opinion, and they've had experiences with, let's say, when we're designing financial services, they've had experiences with other financial services apps, and their own bank, and they bring that bias into specific projects. But yeah, getting that clarity is key, and
Mm,
you need to be on the same page for sure.
yeah. What I'm thinking about kind of advice for other agency leaders that are bridging kind of the brand and experience. Um, like, what should they focus on to like build a truly integrated offering there? What should they be focusing on?
Yeah. Well, I feel that a lot of times agencies will separate like just brand design or creative design from UX, and
Mm,
you can, but I think oftentimes it's great when they're integrated. It just ends up building a way better brand system, a way better product.
mm,
You're really kind of understanding from both ends, hierarchy, behavior design. You understand how you measure design a lot better. So
mm,
oftentimes, if you invest in design thinking, that's really helpful. I find hiring people that have hybrid talents, or
mm,
are hybrid thinkers, like bring on multiple skill sets into a role. I feel that's um, that's really valuable.
mm,
And also, and this is something I personally feel really strongly about, is before jumping into execution, because whenever you get a project, that's like sometimes people are just thinking of the end product, is spend some time thinking about the strategy, and maybe that means you need to hire people that can do that well, if your team isn't able to do that yet. But
mm,
really, um, um, helping with embedding strategy before the execution will ultimately ensure that you have a better quality product, or better quality design, or output, and then also ensures that there's not as much rework. You're aligned. There's clarity. You can even take that strategy to the customer to ensure that
mm,
you guys are all aligned.
mm,
That the strategy piece, I find, is also key.
mm.
So take the time to build the strategy before you jump into the final step and get excited about the execution, and how things are going to look.
Yeah, yeah. It's a good reminder for designers, right? Because I think sometimes we're so anxious to get right to the design, the fun stuff, right? But the strategy is really so powerful and really
Yeah,
determines the how successful the campaign ultimately is.
absolutely. Yeah. Cool.
Well, thank you so much. This is a lot of fun. Where can people follow along your journey and stay in the loop?
Yeah. Follow me on LinkedIn. That's kind of where my main communication channel is. So
Yep.
I do have a website. I can share that with you as well, but LinkedIn is probably the best
Okay.
place. Yeah.
Well, we'll make sure to link everything in the show notes.
Great.
So, thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam. This was great. A pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Pixel Perfect podcast, where we go down the rabbit hole on the journey and motivations of creatives and entrepreneurs. Stay tuned for more stories to come. Until next time.